Gary Coleman brought joy and laughter to people for decades, but he had one of the saddest lives ever, and he died due to abuse from his parents. Gary Coleman was adopted in 1968 after his biological parents couldn't afford to keep him, and he was adopted by his father named Wayne, who was a forklift operator, and his mom Ammonia, who was a nurse. His parents didn't know when they adopted him he was actually born with a rare kidney condition called nephritis, which is a very rare condition where a person's kidneys deteriorate, and Gary Coleman was actually told he was going to die when he was 5 years old until an emergency kidney transplant was performed on him. And to make things worse, Gary Coleman's parents couldn't afford the medical bills to go with his treatments, and his mom actually had to quit work to take care of him. Because Gary Coleman couldn't have a regular school schedule, the parents got into the idea of getting him as a child acting, where he landed his first role in 1974 at the age of 6, which was a commercial for a local bank. Because that when Gary Coleman was 8 years old, he got picked up for a reboot of The Little Rascals, which was supposed to come out in 1977, where he did star in it, but it never made it past the pilot, so it ended up failing. Even though that failed, that same year Gary Coleman made a comeback with the show The Jeffersons, where even though he only did a single episode, he was praised by all the magazines saying he was a show stealer. Because that a year later, Gary Coleman was asked to become the star of a new show called Different Strokes, where they paid him $1,500 an episode for the first season, and he ended up making $36,000 total. And if that doesn't sound like a lot of money, his salary kept on going up and up because of the popularity of the show, where he ended up getting paid $70,000 an episode, and off of special appearances as well as the salary from the show, he made $18 million. The issue was his health got worse and worse throughout the show, where when he was 12 years old, he learned that he wouldn't actually be growing due to his condition. Which there is a common misconception that Gary Coleman had dwarfism, which would normally lead to him having a relatively healthy life, but instead the reason he was kept so short was because of his kidney condition and the medications he had to take. Because of this, Gary Coleman had a huge issue with the producers on Different Strokes, because he wanted his character to grow up and become a teenager and later an adult, but they wanted him to continue acting like a child while everyone else got older. And this ended up actually being the inspiration for the Batman the Animated Series villain Baby Doll, which was based heavily on Gary Coleman's life. And Gary Coleman revealed because the producers kept him as a kid on Different Strokes, it was actually haunting his career, where when he was 16 years old, he was told he should audition for characters playing an 8-year-old, which he thought was just humiliating. Making things worse for Gary Coleman was his personal life, where when he was 14 years old, he was told he was going to need dialysis 3 times a week or else he'd die. Which dialysis is an extremely draining process because the kidneys are no longer working, so it's the process of actually removing the excess from the kidneys, which is extremely straining on an individual. The network just wasn't following child labor laws when it came to working with Gary Coleman, where he oftentimes was working 80-hour weeks doing the show Different Strokes, and at the same time, whenever he was free, he was doing dialysis. At 17, when Different Strokes was still going on, Gary Coleman was actually told he was going to die if he didn't get a kidney transplant, which he had done when Different Strokes was off-season, and he still returned to his normal work schedule later on. Finally, when Gary Coleman was 18 years old, he was told Different Strokes would be ended, largely because people didn't find him as cute anymore and the ratings were declining, so he said he was going to retire with the millions he made. But sadly, that plan of retiring and just enjoying his life couldn't be, because when he was 18 years old, he learned his parents mismanaged and spent all of his money. Gary Coleman ended up suing his parents in court, where he was awarded $1.3 million, but the problem was they didn't even have that because they already spent it, so he ended up getting really nothing. This was the beginning of the Different Strokes curse, where all 3 of the main child actors had horrible lives after the show ended. The first one being Donna Plato, who got pregnant at 19, and she was written off the show in the 4th season, only doing guest spots afterwards. Before that, Donna Plato did have a huge drug addiction, where she was abusing cocaine when she was just a teenager, and also overdosed from diazepam when she was 14. Then she was arrested twice in 1991, once for armed robbery and the second one for violating her probation. And her drug addiction got so bad she ended up starring in adult movies and magazines just because she needed to pay for her addiction. And then in 1999, at the age of 34, she ended up passing away from a drug overdose, which many people labeled a suicide. And there was also Gary Coleman's TV brother, Todd Bridges, who admitted to having a problem with both meth and crack while he was doing the show. Todd Bridges also got arrested in the early 1990s for attempting to kill his drug dealer, and he was defended by Johnny Cochran, who later became O.J. Simpson's lawyer. And he was arrested later in the 1990s for trying to sell crystal meth again. Todd Bridges was actually able to make a comeback in the late 2000s, doing 112 episodes of World's Dumbest and also 17 episodes of Everybody Hates Chris. But sadly, Gary Coleman wasn't given that same luck, where he ended up moving to Utah working as a security guard because he couldn't pay for his actual bills and had no money left from Different Strokes. He got arrested in 1998 after a woman confronted him asking for a picture, and then when he said no, she told him he was a has-been actor, so he punched her. Then he had another arrest after he got into a fight with a 23-year-old at a bowling alley who was taking pictures of him without his permission. Then he actually made a resurgence in 2003, where he announced he was running for governor of California as a joke for the California recall election. And Gary Coleman didn't even vote for himself, endorsing Arnold Schwarzenegger, who won, but he still got 14,000 votes, putting him at 8th place above 140 people who entered. And that actually helped his career, where he began getting hired again for celebrity cameos, doing commercials, and also TV guest appearances like Drake and Josh. Things went bad for him again in 2007 when he married Shannon Price, where even though they were only married for a year, he still stayed with her and she lived with him until his death in 2010. And the couple definitely had issues, where in 2007, Gary Coleman was charged with a misdemeanor due to a fight he was having with his wife at a mall. And there is a lot of debate on the story for how Gary Coleman actually died, because he fell down a flight of stairs while Shannon was in the house, and she didn't actually use CPR on him and waited and called 911. And many have accused Shannon Price of accidental manslaughter against Gary Coleman, but there just hasn't been enough evidence that she's never been formally charged. Many are probably wondering at this point why I'm pushing more blame on the parents than Gary Coleman's wife, and the reason was after he died, they actually tried to sue the wife for what was left of his $500,000 estate, even though they haven't talked to him in 25 years. Because at the end of the day, none of this would have happened if Gary Coleman's parents didn't steal his money, and he would have had better decisions made in his life. And with that, I'm Charles Pearl. Please subscribe if you learned something.